Good morning. Thank you all for joining us today. The State of Mom event, commemorating the 60th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis. We thank you very much to all the speakers who traveled, made it here to give us this amazing lineup of historians and experts in the field. We will be discussing the idea of this conference, right, is to revisit and rethink the lessons of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it is also happening in this rather historically serendipitous moment where we're also in the grips of a crisis. We have a war in Europe, and the specter of nuclear use is with us again. We often hear in the press, we hear from the analysts that this is probably the most dangerous moment for nuclear war, for nuclear use, the risk of it, since 1962. So the idea of this conference is not only to rethink and revisit the historical lessons, what we know and understand about the crisis today, given all the evidence that has appeared and all the new excellent contributions that have been made to historiography, but also to think what patterns, what factors, what things, what lessons apply from the Cuban Missile Crisis apply today. So we have 4 great panels. You have the agenda and then biographies of all the speakers that you can consult. We will begin with an address from Ash Carter, who is the director of the Belfer Center. He could not, unfortunately, be with us today in person, but he did record a greeting message for all of us. Before we proceed, though, allow me to thank the team at the project of managing the ADA and also our co-sponsors and partners for this event, the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center's Applied History Project and the Intelligence Project. All that's some folks that are here with us today. Thank you so much. And without further ado, please let's hear it from Ash Carter.
I call upon Chairman Khrushchev to halt and eliminate this clandestine, reckless, and provocative threat to world peace.
На нас довели информацию, что в ближайшие часы возможна высадка американского десанта.
Greetings to all the attendees at this very important conference. I wish I could be there myself. I'm unable to be there, and therefore am pleased to have this opportunity to talk to the subject of the conference, and I'll look forward eagerly to learning its results. The Cuban Missile Crisis came for a generation, of people a little bit older than myself, who were used to ducking under their desks and to the notion that nuclear war was possible. What the Cuban Missile Crisis, so this Cuban Missile Crisis was not their first nuclear scare. However, what it did etch in their minds, and has etched in all of our minds for the ensuing 60 years now, was the concept that a nuclear war and a nuclear attack could be accidental, could be inadvertent. And that was a new idea in the 1960s, and a very fertile idea it was. It gave birth to a great number of innovations, I'll call them, in matters nuclear in the succeeding decades, very fruitful, I think, innovations. It led to the concept of strategic stability in a crisis, and the consequences of strategic stability, which undergirded arms control. both of offensive weapons and also ultimately of defensive weapons. The idea of arms control and defensive weapons being that since these things couldn't be built that were very effective at defense, they would lead to a false sense of security perhaps on the part of their owner and on the part of their beholder to the belief that they might work, and therefore that the beholder better build more of their own nuclear weapons. And so stability, the idea of strategic stability, led to the idea that it was better to control offensive and defensive arms. That was a fruitful idea. In our country, and we learned at the end of the Cold War, to some extent in the Soviet Union, the idea of accidental war also led us to strengthen our safeguards, our locking mechanisms, the codes and so forth required to unlock nuclear weapons, so-called permissive action links, which predated the Cuban Missile Crisis, but were accentuated or accelerated rather by the Cuban Missile Crisis and the realization that nuclear war could be accidental. It led to a large investment in warning, strategic and especially tactical warning, radars and satellites, and the idea of dual phenomenology, that is, that one should have two sensors based upon different physics that provided information to the president about what was actually happening in a nuclear war. And to the idea rigorously implemented in the United States, I can tell you, as one of the holders of those codes, of procedures and codes that ensure that only the leader of our country is not only authorized, but actually enabled to initiate the use of nuclear weapons. Something that's different from the procedures that we use, for example, for shooting down airliners or for launching defensive missiles, both of which do not require the president, but that the Secretary of Defense or even someone he designates has the authority to do those things, but not to use nuclear weapons. So all that was good. There were some what I would regard as false lessons that came out of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The one is the risk that all of foreign policy and all of geopolitics would be reduced to the notion of managing crises. And that, I think, taken too far, led to some thinking in American foreign policy channels that were astrategic and not good for us. There also was, in that mode of thinking of the Cuban Missile Crisis, a implicit moral equality between the Soviet Union and the United States, a moral inequality that, in my opinion, is not justified. But at any rate, good lessons were learned. Those lessons steered generations of policymakers for 60 years, largely in a good direction. As the organizers and my colleagues at the Belfer Center know, I believe strongly in the value of using the discipline of history in what we do at the Belfer Center. I have said many times that real people and real leaders in the real world don't use political science. They don't use economics. They don't even use physics, I'm sad to say. As a physicist, they don't use any of those academic things except history. And so of all the disciplines of academia, the one most important in the real world is history. And its disciplined use is therefore important. And therefore a conference at Belfer that looks back on history and tries to make sense of it is right down the alley of what the Belfer Center ought to be doing. And in that connection, I should say that those of us who try to use history, you try to use it carefully. And that means knowing and what about a past event might be like the situation you face today, and what about it might be very different. I raise that because I think today's situation of Vladimir Putin in the Kremlin, to me, suggests more differences than similarities with the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it may be worth saying something and asking you, the attendees, to consider some of the differences. The first of all, in 1960, it really was true that only two nuclear powers essentially mattered a lot. China was fledgling, to put it mildly, almost incapable in the nuclear sphere in those days. And Britain and China, I don't think you could count on. You could count as independent power centers from the United States. So a bilateral nuclear world was a sensible model, and a world of two nuclear equals only. And that persisted from 1960 right through the mid-90s, I would say. The mid-90s was a time I knew well because I was the Assistant Secretary of Defense responsible for many of these matters at the time. And I would say that was the apogee of non-proliferation, which was another lesson learned of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Bad enough to have two countries with nuclear weapons, let's not have more. And in the intervening 35 years, there was a lot of non-proliferation success. In 1995, I participated in one, which was the denuclearization of Ukraine. I was there the day I was the responsible party in the Pentagon for running the Nunn-Lugar program, which destroyed the missiles and bombers in Ukraine and shipped nuclear warheads back to Russia. And I was there in Ukraine that day in June of that year when the last nuclear weapon left Ukraine. And I organized a U.S.-Ukrainian military exercise for that day to signify that Ukraine had traded friends for nuclear weapons for its security, a trade very relevant to today. And similar programs in Belarus and Kazakhstan. Also, I went to the Budapest summit that year with President Clinton, which sealed, I would say, the denuclearization of Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus. Around that time also, we were assisting South Africa to safeguard the nuclear weapons that it had, just to remind everyone. And I think putting the final nails in the coffins of the nuclear weapons programs of Taiwan and South Korea. So that was the high watermark of nonproliferation. And let me just remind you all, which you know, that since then, there's been a lot of ground lost. Iran, Pakistan, India, North Korea. So today, the attention of the nuclear weapons control community, which I hope is represented by the conference attendees at this event, should not be, it cannot be on only two superpowers. Instead, and this is the thought I'd like to leave you with, nuclear weapons are, in today's world, the weapons of choice of the weak, not of superpowers, but of the weak. Putin is weak. He has a country that doesn't matter except for oil and nuclear weapons, whatever he thinks. On the great world stage doesn't matter. And nuclear weapons join a family of weapons of the weak. Cyber is another weapon of the week. Hybrid warfare is another weapon of the week, whether that's blowing up undersea pipelines or other shenanigans of that sort. Little green men. And finally, energy is a weapon of the week. So cyber, energy, hybrid warfare, nukes, these are today the weapons of the week. And I would say our principal nuclear problem in today's world is nuclear weapons in the hands of the weak. That's very different from 60 years ago. And I'm sure that you will all reflect on that fact and try to think for the next 60 years, what do we do about that? And let's hope to God we don't have to live through an event as dangerous and portentous as the Cuban Missile Crisis was to invent our way to nuclear safety for the next 60 years in this era to come. So once again, I'm very sorry I can't be there with you. I thank the organizers, my colleagues here at the Belfer Center, who put this conference on, all the attendees, many of them friends of mine. I'll miss seeing you, and I'll look forward to learning the results.
Great. Well, great. Thanks to Ash for these words, thought-provoking. I hope we can have some discussion about these propositions by Ash Carter. And allow me to welcome a first panel to take your seats. Tom Blanton, Svetlana Savranskaya, Scott Sagan, and Graham Allison. Please come and join us here. So before we start, let me just, Tom has kindly agreed to moderate this panel, but he is an excellent scholar of the Cold War and the crisis in his own right. He's the director of the National Security Archive at the George Washington University in DC. He has been there since 1992. He has done an amazing job in filing the Freedom of Information request together with his team at the National Security Archive. You will find more information in his bio that you have, but let me just highlight that there's 60,000 FOIAs that have been filed and for a wealth of documents declassified for historians to consult and use in their work. And he's also somewhat of a superstar in our field. He's a winner of the Annie Award in 2004 for individual achievement in news and documentary research. And also on behalf of the National Security Archive received the George Polk Award in 2004, piercing self-serving veils of government secrecy. I think those are very important words to end with. And with that, Tom and the panel, floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mariana. It's a real pleasure to be here. This is now that Graham is here, I can say this is probably the most distinguished panel I've gotten to moderate on the Cuban Missile Crisis since Havana in 2002, when sitting across from me was Fidel Castro. Sitting here was Robert McNamara, and down the other end of the table was General Anatoly Gribkov, glowering at me and wondering why the Cubans had let a Yankee imperialist be the chair of the panel, right? So I'm grateful to Mariana for being more ecumenical. You're in for an incredible treat today with this distinguished panel. It's all of us who studied the Cuban Missile Crisis stand on the shoulders of giants. And there are no more capacious shoulders to stand on than those of Graham Allison. His book, Essence of Decision from 1971, probably stands today with its revision as the most influential political science book in my lifetime, and certainly the best-selling one. Graham's brilliant career building the Kennedy School, the Belfer Center, cooperative threat reduction, track 1 and track 2 dialogues all over the world as illuminating insights in international politics remain legendary today. I can go on and on, we'd be here all day, but that's I'm going to call on Graham first, and I'm just giving you my heads up on that. Second will be Svetlana Savranskaya, who's the director of Russian programs at the National Security Archive, and really the world's expert on two core facets of the Cuban Missile Crisis. One is the Soviet submarines armed with nuclear torpedoes at the quarantine line unbeknownst to the United States Navy. And second, the crisis of November, when the tactical nuclear weapons were made in Cuba. Cuba was done to become a nuclear power, and Svetlana negotiated them out. Svetlana worked with Goyan Sergo to publish the Goyan archive. Let us understand how Svetlana not only saved the world and created the bedrock for today's non-proliferation regime. Our third speaker today who's going to bring us up to the present, Scott Sagan, distinguished professor at Stanford, whose book, The Limits of Safety, is a linchpin, really keystone of what Ash Carter mentioned above. The discourse is now not about megatonnage and escalatory ladders, but about accidents, inadvertent nuclear war, miscalculation, misperception. Scott really has driven that discourse. And now it's on the cutting edge, I would say, of nuclear scholarship in his new works about the rule of law, and civilian targeting, and what are we doing with these thousands of nuclear warheads, withholding, are we targeting civilians? How are we not targeting civilians and complying with anything like the Geneva Convention? So Scott will bring us up to the present with some lessons, I think, for today. But let me just ask Graham to kick off, who is really the legend in our field. It's a real honor.
Thank you. My goodness, such a generous introduction. I don't want to inhale, but anyway, I appreciate it. My wife might even believe it. This is a fantastic conference. I congratulate Mariana, but just that and the MTA teams for taking the lead here on our 60th anniversary of the crisis. I think this is a subject I've been studying for a very long time, and basically I can continue to find it endlessly fascinating and to learn new things every day about it, or every day that I focus on it and think about it. And I think this conference is a beautiful opportunity for us to continue around the world. There's a clear directions that we can take this. And I have listed a dozen unanswered questions about the Cuban Missile Crisis. It seems like very incredible historians about all this documentation, how come so many questions about which there's uncertainty, evidence of this. But I'm going to focus today in my 10 minutes, and I look forward to the conversation on the connections between the applied history undertaking that's a major part of the center and Stanford Institute now the Broadway movement and the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it's a question of whether we can actually learn lessons from and we learn lessons from the Missile Crisis that we can apply to help verify challenges and choices like what we're facing in Europe. That's already settled that thing. Basically, this is part of ongoing discussion and debate here. And we're trying to make it a little more pointed. I'm going to pose 3 simple questions, which obviously are not simple answers, but they give simple answers in an effort to try to be provided. The question 1 is, can we usefully learn lessons from that policymakers, from history, that policymakers can apply to eliminate current challenges and choices? The second question is, do states learn lessons from history that they recommend as advice for their successors, thinking about it? And the third question is, are Biden and his national security team today reviewing lessons, reviewing what JFK did in the Cuban Missile Crisis, for clues about their strategy and meeting the current challenge posed by Putin's invasion of Ukraine and threats to tactical weapons. Each of these can be a long dissertation, but short answers. Can we usefully learn lessons from history that we can offer to policymakers facing challenges and choices? Unfortunately, when professional historians are asked this question and consider it in the abstract, they frequently respond in ways that would lead you to believe that the answer was no. So even here in the Kennedy tool, we regard ourselves as followers of St. Ernie, for instance, we have to recognize that in last year's like Ernie, from time to time, almost expanded the possibility of policymakers learning simple lessons. That even occasionally would say things that were quite contrary to what they actually practiced, but nonetheless, of the abstract section. 1680 to 50 years was known that people were the policymakers were so determined that issues that would be better simply manage the manage status towards our status. Our colleague Fred Loderville, late this year, he picked up Ernie's mayor redirecting, renovating the fourth Ernest May, and if we listen to Fred enough, he and I had said it, he would say that, well, be careful, this is something that he wrote. Be careful about being bamboozled by analogies. Unless this is too easy, and they encourage misuse. And our former colleague, when he came to go to most it's got please the New York Times comment for you or the title was historians should not be puppets. And this flip line said analogies are more than useless. They can be dangerous because they never repeat themselves. I would say, yes, of course, all evidence of analysis can be misused. I would say, yes, political leaders who are advocates for positions will use all sorts of evidence and analysis, including statistics, economics, and science. But I nonetheless believe that the answer to the first question, can we usefully learn lessons from history, is unambiguously yes. Now, the second question is say some learn lessons from history that they think they can offer to theirs effectively as useful advice about the different things. And again, my answer is unambiguously yes. JFK certainly did. We did remember what he said was the central lesson of the Cuban Missile Crisis for being their favorite of the direction Putin spoke to the Biden about going forward. And I think I have a slide here that works. Can you do me a slide picture?
Yes.
Next slide, please.
Next slide. Yeah.
All right.
Above all, from defending our own vital interests, nuclear power must avert those confrontations which bring an adversary to a choice of either a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. To adopt that kind of course in the nuclear age would be evidence only of the bankruptcy of our policy, our collective death wish.
So JFK,
Above all,
we good. Go back to the next, go back to the previous slide, but don't wait. It's good. JFK believed, he said it before he wrote, and then it's his sort of important foreign policy speech, offered what he thought was the central takeaway lesson from the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it says, quote, above all, while defending our vital interests, nuclear powers must avert confrontation that force an adversary to choose between humiliating defeat and nuclear war. Was that a good lesson? I believe yes. Is it a sturdy lesson? Yes. Is it an informative lesson? Yes. It's a relevant lesson? Yes. So, another lesson Kennedy learned in the Cuban Missile Crisis and been taught, and this is an idea that I'm working on now, and I'll be interested in my comments, suggestions, or others. I think, in addition to what became what we now know as the nuclear term, so no use of nuclear weapons in war since Nagasaki, even though we came right to the edge of it in the Cuban crisis. That Kennedy learned and his successors have learned what I call a non-nuclear term. This is an idea I've been trying to struggle with in the context of Ukraine. And what was the non-nuclear term? We can take the next slide, please. So the non-nuclear term says, if you do not conduct a strike on your nuclear adversary that kills hundreds or thousands of his uniformed forces, because if you do, you're entering a full-scale war. Interestingly, on every occasion, including Truman when there was the Berlin blockade, and Eisenhower when there was the uprising in Hungary that the CIA had actually helped encourage, but were then being slaughtered by Soviet troops. And if you go on down the list, Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis, both with the initial fire and his worries at the very end. But every success, including George Bush, when Putin sent forces into Georgia in 2008 to prevent Georgia from fighting its way that they come. And now Ukraine, American presidents and Soviets and Russians have refused to order strikes on the uniform officers of other parts of the nuclear hemisphere that could kill hundreds of thousands, 4,000. And other lessons from these individual practices, but then after I, you know, one of the lessons that I haven't taken account of sufficiently, that I have thought, I've had second thoughts of it. But I think the lesson that JFK learned in the crisis, but that I totally scared about the think about more later, is captured in another line in Kevin's speech that I think relates to it about it. And let's see if we can play that.
So let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interest and the means by which those differences can be resolved. And it cannot end now our differences. At least we can help make the world safe. The person. For the final analysis, our most basic common lesson is that we all have it. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future. And we are all fun.
So, a world safe for diversity. And this has a different, slightly different meaning today, but he was not talking about the current interpretations of diversity. He had come to the perception of the view that coexistence in fact was a necessity because the alternative was co-destruction. Well, that's a pretty big idea. That means that if I'm facing an evil energy, and he had no doubt that there's something to do with evil, and I'm representing, I'm the champion of good, and no doubt that the U.S. and the people are good, that nonetheless, if I get into a nuclear war, I'm destroying both of us. And so we've got to focus on building a world safe for diversity. That's a pretty radical idea. And I didn't appreciate it sufficiently all the time. I thought about it afterwards. But those of you just want a local anecdote. If you're walking between the Grand Hotel and the Kennedy School building, there's two pillars there going down into the park. And each entry to the park, there are pillars with quotations from JFK. And when we were building the park, we had one exercise. So many what things you that what was you could put sorts of it was done one entry. He had his list of things. I finally advertised faithfully in Mowbray from the never be deterred by anybody. And Ken and I conspired, but which one's bigger? The target was especially stuck on having this quote, they was the world safe university. Look at the pillar there going into the bark between the two. There's that quotation that being unable to resolve our differences at this point, we nonetheless have to focus on building the world safe university. So does that have some resonance in the current confrontation of Russia, and maybe even in the current building confrontation with China over the future? And I think the answer probably is.
Thank you, organizers, for inviting me here. This is a great idea to use experiments. And I have to say, I stayed here listening to Graham's presentation, and I felt that I am right now at the epicenter of the study of the Cuban Missile Crisis. It really is amazing. I just add a personal note, when I just came here to the United States, to Emory University, my very first project was the Cuban Missile Crisis, political world history, the James White and Jim Lane. Yes, and went into school, and as a graduate student, I got to go to Cuba, organize the Russian delegation, and spend the night with President Castro and Callas with the delegation. And I was there when we both took out his documents and made a presentation saying we had tactical nuclear weapons in Cuba and the commanders were authorized to use them, at which point Secretary McNamara went like this, with the social media, he said, is the translation correct? Said, you sure? I'm asking, sure. And in the break, he wanted me to go back to the people and ask him to repeat what he just said. And the both looked at us like this, and he said, do you want me to sign an affidavit? It was something like really being present at history, and here I am in a way in full circle back to the origins of the study of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So maybe you could tell the audience might not know who Gripkov is. Yeah, Gripkov was the planner of Operation Anali, and then later in the 1980s, as General Gripkov then he became the commander of United Forces of the Warsaw Pact. But back in 1962, he was the main leader supervising a group of military officials who planned the deployment. And in 1992, he was the official head of the Soviet delegation. And once I got to know him, then it became very easy for me to call other people and say, well, you know, General Report just agreed to head the delegation when we're organizing to go to Cuba to study the Cuban Missile Crisis. Everybody said, oh, they both actually agreed. Not only he agreed, he brought classified documents. And when I was organizing that team, they were the Soviet military, right? The Soviet military and Soviet diplomats. We had Ambassador Vibranian, we had Svetlana, the son of Anastasia, and three military diplomats. So when they landed in Cuba on January 6th, 1992, they were no longer Soviet military or Soviet diplomats that just lost their country. And the military were really angry about it. And so they were willing to give it all like it was and reveal all the secrets, some of them even in a slightly exaggerated way, when they both said the local commanders were authorized to use nuclear weapons. It was a little bit of a stretch. There was debate after that, whether it was true or not. Eventually, it came out that they did get oral authorization when they were deployed, but then later, Khrushchev and Mayakovsky never actually signed the order to give authorization. So they were in this gray zone where they weren't authorized orally when they went in. They had the abilities physically, they could launch those tactical weapons. But during the crisis, we actually saw when we got the documents, this ambivalence, because on the 26th and the 27th, Khrushchev sent two telegrams to Kyiv to categorically forbidding them to use tactical nuclear weapons, the Cardinal Belfer. So they knew that these people were orally authorized, so they wanted to make sure they didn't actually follow that authorization. So studying the Cuban Missile Crisis now for 30 years, what lessons do I think we learned? We as historians, and I'm speaking just about historians, and I agree with Graham that we can never be sure that the politicians will actually burn these up. I think, and it really is difficult to go after Graham because he already talked about lessons in his wonderful article in Mars today, which is not. But I think just from the study of the dynamics of the crisis, I think lesson number one is the importance of diplomacy. And here I will just mention, I will not go into detail about different narratives for the crisis. Both countries tried to build their own narrative of the crisis. For the American side, it was the narrative of tough masculinity. We went eyeball to eyeball, and the other blinked and won, and we pushed them out. That was certainly the wrong lesson. And the Soviets, the population generally did not know anything about the nuclear element of the Cuban Missile Crisis. I was at Moscow State University in 1988, and I had a very good rector, professor who was teaching foreign policy, history of foreign policy, and he said, now I will reveal a big secret to you because now we have classes.
1988, 88.
He said, we actually deployed nuclear weapons to Cuba. This was the first time I've studied history all the time. And he said, now we can talk about it, but we actually deployed nuclear weapons to Cuba. And that is why the crisis was so dangerous. So the official story of the Soviet Union was that the Soviet Union provided defensive weapons to Cuba, and we built up the Cuban defenses. And by doing that, we pressured the United States into giving guarantees of non-invasion. Once those guarantees were given, we took back part of the weapons, but still left a lot in Cuba, and therefore it was victory. In fact, we know now, after looking at endless documents from some of the participants, that it was diplomacy that resolved the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was, first of all, the willingness on both sides to negotiate. It was the letter that Khrushchev wrote about the war and the horrors of the war and the need to untie the knot that they tied together. So Khrushchev realized his mistake, was looking for a way out, and Kennedy offered him the way out by agreeing to move the troops from Turkey. That was resolved the crisis. And amazingly, it was an oral assurance which was kept by the United States. But even more amazingly, the promise to keep the compromise secret was kept by the Soviets all this time, even though it was politically so inconvenient to Kennedy, because certainly we didn't Khrushchev's part. Because in the presidium, of course, they knew that he took the weapons there, took the weapons back, and he was criticized to the tribute to approval eventually in 1964. And yet, nobody said a word until 1989, when the Britain and the conference in Moscow asked the American delegation, so are we going to say the truth? Did we agree on this? Only then it became normal. So diplomacy resolved the crisis. That is lesson number one. Second lesson, I would say, and Graham spoke about it beautifully, nuclear weapons and proliferation. Nuclear weapons are dangerous, and I would say tactical nuclear weapons are most dangerous because they are easier to use, even though now, of course, we have a lot of better technology that allows for permissive ways and makes them more difficult to use. But they're tempting that they seem to be a smaller weapon, a weapon that can fight the other weapon that can be used in case of particular military installation or a group of forces. Tactical nuclear weapons, as we learned from the Cuban Missile Crisis, were very disfiguring. But now looking back, we know exactly how a nuclear war, strategic nuclear war, could have started during the Missile Crisis, because the Soviets deployed a lot of tactical nuclear weapons to Cuba. There were 98 nuclear warheads, tactical nuclear warheads. That is in addition to medium-range missiles. And the American side did not know about that deployment. These were the weapons that were intended to be used against the deployment of U.S. forces on the island. So if invaders came to the island, they would be attacked by tactical nuclear weapons. And in fact, first nuclear tactical nuclear weapon would be used against one element of the base, right? So just imagine the pressure into which Kennedy would find himself to respond if his forces were incinerated by a nuclear weapon. That would have led most likely to very quick escalation. We know also that before Soviet submarines were carrying one nuclear torpedo each,
And there were situations on those submarines where commanders considered to use that torpedo. Fortunately, very fortunately, they realized upon submerging, upon surfacing, that they were not at war, but they were under impression, unable to communicate with the center, being under the water. They were under impression that they were being attacked. And under attack, they had authorization to use those weapons. Use them or lose them, even if you don't have authorization and you're attacked and you're like losing your life in the submarine, what you're gonna do? Well, you're gonna respond. So I would add one story which I think shows both the dangers of tactical nuclear weapons and the importance of diplomacy. So after the exchange of the letters between Kennedy and Khrushchev, and after we all thought, well, those people who lived at that time thought that the Cuban Missile Crisis was over, resolved, but the forces still remained on DEFCON 2, the American forces. Khrushchev had to deal with his own crisis because he knew what else was in Cuba. And the initial decision was to leave those tactical nuclear weapons in Cuba and gradually, over time, train the Cuban military to use them, and then move the Soviet military off the island, but do it gradually, because it was a massive deployment, and we did not want the Americans to find out what else was there. But Khrushchev understood that Castro was humiliated, angry, and he did not want to talk to any of the Soviets. He felt betrayed by the Soviets. So Khrushchev sends Anastas Mikoyan, deputy prime minister, who was considered to be the Cuban on the Politburo, sends him to Cuba to do what? To negotiate with Castro. And I would say Mikoyan is the man who saved the world, because he faced the Cubans who were angry, unwilling to give up the weapons, and at the same time, his task was to still keep Cuba as an ally. He couldn't just say, we're forcing you to remove your weapons. Even the Soviets in Cuba, the Soviet military, were so influenced by the revolutionary rhetoric, by this emotional wave of anti-imperialist struggle. They were willing to fight and die with the Cubans. So here comes Mikoyan, who has to negotiate with Castro and be almost a therapist for him, explaining we're still allies, we will give you absolutely everything you want, economic aid, military aid, but we have to take these missiles back. But we will leave everything else, meaning the tacticals. He said, after we remove these offensive weapons that Kennedy was talking about, you will still have the strongest military presence on your soil in the socialist camp. He said stronger than the one in East Germany, because you will have all these newest destructive weapons. And Castro said, no, okay, that's fine. So Cuba will become the strongest, most powerful country in socialist law. But during his negotiations, Mikoyan realizes that you can't leave these weapons for these people. They're young, they're passionate, they're emotional. In one of the conversations, Che Guevara says, well, if I had a nuclear warhead, I would immediately put it on New York. And then Mikoyan, by the end of his stay in Cuba, he writes back to Khrushchev. He says, we can't leave these weapons here in his hands. We gotta take them back. And he proposes what Tom termed the beginning of non-proliferation regime. He actually makes up a law. He writes to Khrushchev, what if I tell the Cubans that we have a law, a secret law, which prohibits us from transferring nuclear weapons to anybody? There is no law like this. but he just made it up. And Khrushchev authorizes it. So in his next meeting with Castro, Mikhail says, well, we can't leave these weapons here. And Castro is, of course, fuming and saying, how come? Nobody will ever find them, we'll hide them in the caves. He actually, he begs Mikhail to leave these weapons there. Mikhail says, no, we have a secret law. It's not published, nobody knows about it. But this law prohibits us from leaving nuclear weapons in anybody's hands. And Castro realizes that's the final decision. And after that, the Soviets never transferred tactical nuclear weapons or any nuclear weapons to the Allies. And actually, as far as I know, did not discuss that possibility. So that shows you how dangerous the Cuban Missile Crisis really was and how skillfully it was negotiated, both at the grand level between the Soviet leadership and American leadership, and then completely secretly by Mikhail. Just imagine if suddenly, like in November, after the crisis was over, the Americans discovered that there were tactical nuclear weapons in Cuba, and what if Cubans tried to take possession of them? All the awful possible scenarios. So coming back again, nuclear weapons are very dangerous, but tactical weapons are even more dangerous because they lead to escalation. And diplomacy is the way out of the crisis, and not posturing and bragging about, I have this weapon, I can use it. Thank you.
Well, it gives me great pleasure to come back to Harvard where I was a graduate student, and it's very nice to come back home in that way. Knowing that I was going to be here giving this talk, I wrote up my version of what lessons I think we have learned, others that we have not learned, and some appearing as comes to the Wall Street Journal tomorrow morning. So I'm going to give you a preview of what I say in that, because some of the lessons have been touched on already. Some are different, and some are stirring. So point number one has already been mentioned. Don't deploy tactical nuclear weapons to field commanders. Svetlana has already highlighted this, but I want you to pay special attention to the dates in which she noted that Khrushchev withdrew the authorization to use the tactical weapons. It was not until in the middle of the crisis. So had JFK followed the unanimous advice of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and ordered the airstrike and land and invasion, those cruise missiles and tactical missile launchers would have been used on the beachheads and against the carrier task force. And the base authorization should keep that timing in mind. It was only after he realized, oh, the Americans might be invading, do I really want the war to begin with tactical nuclear weapons that Khrushchev withdrew? And we had a surprise attack, he would not have withdrawn that at time. So I think that's very important. Here there's a lesson for Ukraine. Vladimir Putin has repeatedly talked about forces going on alert, including when he announced the invasion of Ukraine, but we have not seen any, what Pentagon calls muscle movement. No more mobile missiles being sent out, no extra submarines being put to sea, no bombers being put on alert, and certainly no movement out of the igloos, tactical weapons out of the igloos going into Ukraine. That would be exceedingly dangerous. Whether they learned the lesson or not, I don't know. But what this does mean is whatever Putin's ultimate decision comes was, we're not yet on the nuclear brink, and that's important to keep in mind. Lesson number two, avoid nuclear activities that could create an accidental detonation or could be seen as a prelude to an attack. Much of the scholarship is focused on events that the leaders on both sides didn't control and nonetheless took steps towards war. The Khrushchev didn't order the destruction of one of the U-2s flying over Cuba. Scared him when he realized that had happened. Kennedy found out that a U-2 had flown, one of our U-2s had accidentally flown over the Soviet Union. What he didn't know, which was more dangerous in my mind, was that the F-102As in Alaska that were sent up to rescue our lost U-2 had tactical nuclear weapons on board because their main job was to shoot down Soviet bombers. But they get this SOS call from a U-2 that says there are MiGs underneath me, help me. There was no time to deload their nuclear weapons. So they were launched with a single pilot. The only weapon that he had to help rescue U-2 was a Genie or Falcon air-to-air launched tactical nuclear weapon. That could have started a war. So let's talk already about the submarines. I want to note two more positive, somewhat reassuring signs about lessons that we've learned. One is that just in March this year, March 2022, the Russian Ministry of Defense and the US European Command was tasked to set up a special deconfliction hotline. So just as we have been doing in Syria, create a special one for Europe so that there's to reduce the likelihood of an accidental fly-in or an accidental killing of soldiers on either side through conflicted interactions. A less well-known incident occurred during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I don't think this was ever in the learning actions that came immediately afterwards. At Vandenberg Air Force Base in 1962, as is the case today, the U.S. has ICBMs that we use. They're launched towards the Kwajalein Atoll to make sure their systems are reliable and are accurate. We put radios on them, and they let us know. In the middle of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Strategic Air Command loaded up 9 of the 10 test missiles at Vandenberg with real nuclear warheads aimed them at Soviet Union. They added a little more oomph to the deterrent than we were already at. Then, October 26th at 4 a.m., without any announcement, the local base commander launched the 10th test missile. Now, he launched the right one, the only one with the radios on it. But no one thought, what if the Soviets had intercepted the message that we were loading up real nuclear warheads on those missiles? What if they had a base watcher, which they usually did have near bases or inside? No one thought about telling people in Washington, should we launch this? Because it was standard procedure. We have a schedule. I've got to launch these and we have a pre-planned schedule. Here, I think we did learn something. Because this April, the Pentagon announced that it was not, it would postpone test missile launches out of Vandenberg. As the administrative spokesman told the press, we should always bear in mind the risk of miscalculation and take steps to reduce those risks. The administration was criticized for being weak by postponing a test launch. I think they had exactly the right lesson to learn. Lesson 3 is beware of commitment traps. Political leaders can be tempted to issue verbal threats for the sake of deterrence, and they would not really want to implement if the act occurs. Such declarations add to the credibility of the leader's position by staking his or her reputation on promise to follow through. But precisely for this reason, if deterrence fails, the leader risks being pushed, compelled to take the undesired action. And I think that partly caused the Cuban Missile Crisis. JFK, thinking that this was going to deter potential deployment, said the gravest issues would result if the Russians actually put offensive weapons there. And then in the middle of the crisis, when he found out about what they had done, he told the ex-com privately, last month I said we weren't going to allow it. Last month I should have said we don't care. But when I said we're not going to, and then they go ahead and do it, and then we do nothing, then I think our risks increase. And here I think this is quite reassuring that thus far, the Biden administration has been remarkably disciplined in making threats that if the Russians use nuclear weapons, there'll be catastrophic consequences. But saying, as Jake Sullivan said, we are not going to engage in a game of rhetorical tit for tat. President Biden said this would be utterly, completely unacceptable, but has not said what we're actually going to do. And that's good. That kind of calculated ambiguity avoids you prematurely being stuck in doing something that when it happens, you feel this is going to trap. Lesson number 4 is develop effective and de-escalatory military options. How should the US and NATO respond if the Russians do use a nuclear weapon in Ukraine? The risk that I think still remains real. Well, I think the lesson here is just to focus on what John F. Kennedy did, is to insist that we have a de-escalatory quarantine, a firm action, but not the initiation of war, which is what the Joint Chiefs were advocating. Here, I believe we do have many conventional military options, and I'm not privy to what the so-called Tiger team in Washington is doing now, but they have, since the very beginning of this war, been seeking to think through how should we respond, and the answer clearly depends on the kinds of weapons used, targets used, whatever conditions. But they've been thinking a lot. And here, I want to remind people that there have been war games on this kind of question in the past. In 2016, the Obama administration had a classified, high-level war game in which the Russians launched a single nuclear strike against a NATO air base in the Baltics. And one group of Obama deputies, including Avril Haines and Colin Kahl, said, well, we're going to actually use a conventional strike. We're going to de-escalate. We're going to take a firm action and attack the base for which this came, but we're going to use conventional weapons only. The principals the next day held the same exercise. In their war game, they said, no, we have to respond with nuclear escalation. We have to respond in kind. And they decided that they were going to use nuclear weapons against the Russian base. When told that under Russian doctrine, the Russians would feel compelled to respond by attacking the United States, they retreated a bit and said, let's use nuclear weapons, but we'll use them against Belarus, even though Belarus wasn't. The deputies had it right, in my judgment, and therefore I'm very pleased that Colin Kahl, the Undersecretary of Defense, and Avril Haines is the head of national intelligence today. And here, I'll give one final lesson. Here, I think there may be some disagreement. I think we should focus on the ultimate off-ramp. Many people talk about diplomacy and the Jupiter deal and the guaranteed people, all of which I think are important. I think the non-invasion pledge was far more important than anything else that was added to the diplomatic deal. And last week, President Biden himself told a group of donors in New York, we're trying to figure out what's Putin's off-ramp. My concern is that Putin's not the kind of guy who takes off-ramps. He is capable of spinning abject failures into false narratives of success. So he can, even if it's forced to do something different, can spin it to his own public. He doesn't have the same kind of commitment trap problem that I think Democratic leaders often have. Remember how he announced after the Russian troops retreated from Kiev that he really only wanted to take Donbass anyway. And just this Monday, he backed away a little bit from the nuclear threat by saying, quotes, if attempts to carry out terrorist attacks on our territory continue, the measures taken by Russia will be tough, and in their scale will correspond to the level of threats posed to the Russian Federation. So in the coming weeks and months, I think what's going to make Putin so dangerous is not a commitment check problem and not lack of an off-ramps, that he has delusions of greatness and it has a strong, vengeful personality and has a habit of doubling down rather than compromising. Putin does not need a diplomatic off-ramp, he needs to take it to retirement. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin recently noted that any decision to use nuclear weapons is Putin's alone, and that's technically true. But a decision has to be implemented by many layers in the Russian military. And I don't know what we're saying privately to the Russian military leadership. I think they don't care much about the Geneva Conventions or the UN Charter, but they care about their own lives, their country's security, and their army's failure, and it must be incredibly painful for them to see the destruction of Russia's military forces in Ukraine today. So I hope that we're communicating quietly and often to the Russian military not to follow any unhinged orders from Mr. Putin in the future, especially the orders to use nuclear weapons. Anyone who orders nuclear use and anyone who implements such orders, we should say, will be held accountable. Washington should be reminding all Russians that the Ukrainian victory in this war will not be an existential threat to Russia. It will be an existential threat to Vladimir Putin. And that's different. So I don't think we can predict, I don't think we should officially make an end of Vladimir Putin's regime our official policy. But we've come pretty close when we call him a war criminal. To make it more difficult over the long term to have a relationship with him. I can't predict who or exactly when Putin will be overthrown from within, but a Russia without Vladimir Putin should be our hope, even though it's not our immediate expectation. Other than that.
Those were just terrific presentations. Let us perhaps take a couple of questions from the audience. We'll just gather maybe 2 or 3 if folks have, I see several hands raised. Let's just gather 3 or 4 questions. Put a name on your question, if you would, who you'd like to ask it to. So those folks can start preparing.
And put your own name on the question.
Unmute the mic.
And Anita with the mic.
Raise your hand so she can identify you.
Yes.
Well, I'm Volodymyr Dlugovic. I'm a professor of international relations from Odessa University in Ukraine.
Well,
yeah, thank you. I'm just having this wow moment here right now. I just arrived to Boston to the US a couple of days ago. Still on a jet lag. I've been in ITD for 7 months and was in training from my home to Odessa. And the first thing I do, I come to this conference, which is amazing. Someone who's been studying and teaching international relations for 30 years now, talking about the 60th anniversary of this crisis, learning so much from the best in the field. I think the people here in this university and this town of Boston are really privileged by having an opportunity to be here today. I definitely am. My question is obviously related to the lessons of the Cuban Missile Crisis, to what is going on with Russian aggression against Ukraine. It's to anyone on the panel, I suppose primarily to Professor Allison and Sagan, but who knows, maybe another from my relation to Don for a couple of years now, would like to contribute as well. How do you, there's discussion about Putin threatening to use nuclear weapons. Is it a bluff? Is it not a bluff? Okay, let's leave it for a moment. But the counter message coming from the West, US, NATO, to Putin, if you really do cross the red line and we would have to retaliate, how credible should that be? And how is that going to be? What's the best way to deliver it? Who do you talk to? Who do you have on the American side or NATO side or both? Who you have to deliver it, for it to be credible. I spent several days on the way here in Warsaw as a World Security Forum and talked to colleagues, and I'm surprised in the way how resolute a lot of people in Europe now, they are actually going to strike if Putin doesn't use this WFG against Ukraine. I was suspicious, I was doubtful, I was skeptical, but it seems to be the consensus, at least among some countries, maybe not the entire NATO bloc, but a coalition of willing, if you like, who are ready to retaliate. But how do you make this credible? How do you make yourself heard in Moscow? Who do you talk to? Do you talk to Putin? Do you talk to the Russian general? Some people say Putin is completely off the racks, and he's not capable of making any rational decisions anymore. So you should probably go straight to some Russian generals who are aware of how devastating such strike can be against Russian military installations and troops in Ukraine. Yeah, and in general, like another lesson from this crisis, like the red line, that you need to maintain to talk to. Good. Yeah. So this is like, So what's the major lesson? Thank you.
Got it. There's a couple more. Here, this gentleman. Okay, go ahead.
Hi, Michael Cavallo, Northeastern University. Wouldn't the submarines having the tactical nukes really be the most dangerous aspect of the process? And that came into play even with Kennedy's sort of middle position of doing the embargo rather than the first strike kind of option, which seems more extreme. But with the first strike, you'd have had a chance of knocking out all the tactical nukes in Cuba before the invasion. But in the case of the submarines, there was no way to hold them back. If you didn't have the accident of Archipov being on that sub, Captain Savranskaya would have watched from B-59 for sure. So wasn't that really the most dangerous point in the crisis? And the last thing I'm going to say is the other thing holding back the United States from more extreme options was just, the Soviet strategic weapons. And so you're not limited to just Cuban responses. But the thing holding back the Soviets was, despite Kennedy knowing about talking with campaign rhetoric about the missile gap, really both sides knew that the US had a huge strategic advantage.
Okay, thanks. This gentleman here.
Hi, one question is...
your name, please? Your name?
Mark Schneider. One of the lessons from the Belfer riots was having, quote unquote, one Cuban missile practice. Then there's a hubris on the part of the administration, McNamara, Rusk, et cetera, perhaps that led them closer into Vietnam because of the hubris of actually winning the Cuban missile practice. Just is there any comments on that?
Great. It's a good first restart. I'll come back and we'll do one more round, but just let us address those. Perhaps, Scott, you want to address how credible the West deterrence red lines messages. Perhaps Svetlana could address the submarine question. Perhaps Graham could address the hubris question.
I don't know exactly what the United States has said to whom in Russia. But Jake Sullivan said publicly that we have communicated directly, privately, at the very high levels of the Kremlin, that any use of nuclear weapons will be met with catastrophic consequences for Russia, and the United States and our allies will respond decisively. So that is the kind of calculated ambiguity that I think is probably the right thing to do. But remember that Putin's nuclear threats have had some deterrent effect on the United States, and they don't. We have not put boots on the ground, have not engaged directly, but rather just armed the Ukrainians. And Putin, despite that, has not launched any attacks into any NATO country, even though he knows that the forces that we're giving to Ukraine are coming in from our NATO allies on the border of Ukraine. The nuclear deterrence has been playing a role there. I think that the conventional options that are being considered are not just arming the Ukrainians with more, but having direct U.S. conventional operations either against Russian forces in Ukraine or against Black Sea Fleet outside of Ukrainian territory. There are conventional options that could be devastating for the Russian military. And I hope that we've been planning appropriate de-escalatory steps of that sort. I'd be shocked if the Tiger teams aren't doing that. And I think that's what's happening at the highest levels of the U.S. government.
Yes, address the submarines.
Yes, the one was most dangerous we will have a special panel on that, so I will not spend much time on that. I'd like to kind of challenge your notion that if there was a surgical strike or strategic strike against Cuba, they would take out tactical nuclear weapons. They had no idea tactical nuclear weapons were there. They would not be able to take out almost any of them. And the moment the first weapon drops, the first bomb drops onto the Cuban soil, the Guantanamo base is attacked by a tactical nuclear weapon. So that would have been the most dangerous outcome. I would say any use of tactical nuclear weapons would be the most dangerous. We know the way it happened, October 27th is the most dangerous day. The U-2 was shot down. The other U-2 was lost over in the Soviet Union. The submarine was surfacing while thinking they are at war. We came very close to a use of nuclear weapon, not necessarily on the submarine. If there was an invasion or if there was a nuclear strike, we know tactical nuclear weapon would be used. So which one was most dangerous? It's very hard to say, but what I can say definitely that if there was a strike against Cuba, it would have automatically led to the use of nuclear weapons. Whereas quarantine was a good de-escalatory measure that allowed space and time for negotiations.
So, thank you. Good questions, 4 points. First, how to deter Putin's tactical nuclear strike on Ukraine? Obviously, in Washington, people have developed a menu of options. I'm very entangled in the discussions. They go from bad, not that they're bad, there's no bad on the list. They go from horrible to worse. This is a thing, this is a parlor game for people playing fantasy foreign policy, finding up beds in the winter. Most of them, I think, are highly resourceful. Secondly, if Putin conducted a nuclear strike, how would the U.S. respond? How would the U.S. make up? And again, the menu goes from even worse than the first list to even more frightening down the list. And again, if you read the Wall Street Journal, John Scott speaks with globally what they've been writing and take their views about what would be proposed to do. It's a pretty fast track, very heuristic track, I would say, to a nuclear, or I would say, fortunately, in Biden, we have somebody that's very sensible, that's looking at the options, thinking about it very soberly. So, third, what's the key point here? Maybe Scott and I disagree with this, but I think the key analytic point is the one JFK taught in what he said was the central lesson of the missile crisis, which is not the hubris, but was the proposition that if Putin is forced to choose between humiliating defeat, Iran, which he knows is the end of Putin. So it's not an existential threat to Russia, but as Scott said rightly, it's an existential threat to Putin. So on the one hand, he's accumulating defeat that's probably the end of his life and regime. And on the other hand, is taking a chance by escalating the level of destruction up to and including tactical nuclear strikes in Ukraine. As I wrote in February, I'm given 41 odds he chooses the latter. 41 odds. So the first step up the ladder of destruction is destroying infrastructure. Watch and see what he's doing today. The next step up the ladder is destroying people. He's not been killing many civilians so far, despite Zelensky's story. If he wants to kill thousands of people, he can attack cities regularly every day. Yeah, well, there's plenty of targets for just with conventional weapons, killing thousands of Ukrainians. And if he wants to move up the ladder, he can use chemical weapons. And then if he wants to conduct a nuclear strike, he can conduct a nuclear strike. So I think it's the Biden effort, as Biden reflected in that conversation that Scott referred to, that says we're looking seriously for off-ramps here, is absolutely the right lesson to have drawn. And will make our professor from Odessa happy. But again, I believe this is not my view. I've said this privately, written publicly. This will require not, and again, this is slightly different, disagree with Scott, not a humiliating defeat that he's got to try to dress up in some way that makes it not a humiliating defeat. He's going to be left, if he stops short, I believe, with some chunk of Ukraine, more than he had on February 24th. And however horrible that will be, it will be less horrible to me than the case in which he conducts the nuclear strike, and then we go back up that ladder. So I don't urge Ukrainians to give up any inch of Ukraine, but I do believe that if this ends successfully, it will end successfully with Putin holding something that he can spin as a success. There was something that we got. We got our land bridge to Crimea. We got a little bit more of Donbass. And at that point, we'll have a stalemate and a line to line. And then my suggestion to Ukrainians is it will take a long time to get their territory back. But if Ukraine goes a successful country and is successful, and I believe it will be, and Russia continues along its current path. Now, I remember the story of West Germany and East Germany. West Germany became a great success. East Germany was a hellhole. Over time, East Germany became part of West Germany. North and South Korea, it's taken a long time, and still the Baltics were captive nations for many years. Was never recognized the annexation of the Baltics. Baltics are not free and successful country, but it may take a long time. But I think if I consider the alternatives, I like Kennedy's lesson. Find a way that doesn't require humiliating defeat, because I think the alternative is this person really will use tactical nuclear weapons and war to avoid what for him would be existential for himself personally.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Graham. Let's take a couple more questions. I know there's a couple of folks right back here, their hands up. This will be our last round. We've got about 10 minutes.
Thank you. Austin Cooper, MIT. Got a question for Scott and a very short question for the panel. The question for Scott is really about the role of strategic ambiguities in the U.S. policy when you say that the U.S. is and should be primarily, perhaps exclusively, aiming out conventional responses. If that is the case, why maintain a policy of strategic ambiguity in terms of communication? For example, the French president went on French television a couple of nights ago and said, we won't use nuclear weapons if Putin chooses to do so on the battlefield. Do you think that even the possibility of U.S. nuclear response serves, without a formal alliance commitment, serves an important deterrent effect? And then my question for the panel is really about tactical nuclear weapons. It seems as though you all agree that these were the most destabilizing factor in the Cuban Missile Crisis. That's what we're all talking about in Ukraine. These seem to be a major global nuclear governance challenge. What can and should we do about tactical nuclear weapons?
Your colleague?
So actually, this probably ties into what Allison, graduate student here at the university. And Professor Sagan, where you had mentioned about the 2016 games set up by Arab Leagues, I think has real relevance to today. And for Professor Allison, using the lens of history, how maybe it conforms to where we are at the moment. Colin calls back then was very strong in his view that
this is an opportunity. If Russia uses even a low yield weapon, we can take the high ground and make that the global pariah, number one. Number two, if we were to strike back nuclear, that would normalize use of nuclear, hence let's not do it. Number three, which all of you mentioned, the power today of conventional is far, far stronger and has much greater potential likely than simply nuclear. On the other hand, you had Susan Rice and others, the principals, who said, absolutely, if we don't use nuclear, that is in defiance of our alliances, that shows weakness, hence we need to move ahead. Tony Blanton at the time, if I recall, he was in the meeting, he was undecided, he saw the strength of both arguments. So wrapping this up into a question, with the lens of history, where does that put us today? And what's your viewpoint as to the outcome of that 2016 workings?
Yes, ma'am, right over here. Right.
Thank you so much for the excellent presentation. My question is...
Your name is?
I'm Sagan. I'm a student at the Fletcher School. And I would try to take the direction of the whole people of India and Pakistan. Recently, the US gave a wave of F-16 fighter jets to Pakistan, and despite India raising concerns about the risk of escalation, the levels of which are unclear. So how does these lessons of when it comes to maintaining the assurance of its USS allies come to play, and what has Cuban Missile Crisis made evident in the form of creating these robust alliances, but at the same time making those assurances and working on those assurances which US provides to its allies, regional allies. Thank you.
So let's have maybe Scott go first on the strategic ambiguity and what to do about tacticals as well.
Well, I would say I've long been an advocate of nuclear no first use doctrines and have briefed on this numerous times in the Pentagon, and the arguments against that tend to be twofold. One is that that if we go that route, it will potentially encourage some of our allies to feel less secure. I think we should combat that judgment rather than have nuclear first use policy or rather than keep a nuclear ambiguity. The other argument is that this could deter a large-scale bio attack. They're less worried about chemical weapons, more worried about biological weapons, given what we know about some programs. And there, I think our goal has to be to adopt a deterrence by denial policy that has the capability to make any biological weapons use ineffective. And therefore, we don't need to respond with weapons even against large-scale attack of that sort. And I agree on this point about the 2016 war game. I think there's a tendency in many strategists to think about tit for tat, think about responding in kind, and that's what adds to credibility for the future. Not doing anything at all, I think, would be quite harmful, because that would encourage future use. But taking de-escalatory actions are important to change the metaphor, I think, that we use is important. People talk about the escalation ladder, which falsely implies that people can sort of walk up and down and that you're in control of it. Nuclear escalation would be like, well, an escalator. Once you get on it, it's really hard to get off. And therefore, what we should do is think about all kinds of credible, conventional actions that could have future deterrent effects, as well as being effective on the ground.
So great questions, all of them would be a good topic for a whole seminar. Let me go back to the very good question, and I like the way you stated it about the 2016 exercise. And both the question, first, what was that for? And secondly, what should we learn from it? And actually, it's all echoes of the Cuban Missile Crisis. If you give normal people a extreme crisis situation that they haven't thought of before, go look at the tapes of the transcript of the ExCom meetings when they come to me initially. What is the first response of everybody, virtually? Strike those missiles now. Don't let them ever become operational. They should never have done something like that. And go for it. That was JFK's initial reaction. That was McNamara's initial reaction. That was everybody's, virtually. So if they had had to make a decision within the first 2 days because of a fear of a leak, there's a 90% chance, I think it's almost for certain, they would order airstrikes. And then just as Svetlana told us, that airstrikes were going to be followed by an invasion, that was all planned, and they would find themselves under nuclear attack. So you look at it, well, wait a minute. Now, why did they make a different choice? Only because they had a week to deliver it. Because they looked at the evidence and considered, well, if we did that, what would happen? And if we did that, what would happen? And so forth. So that was the learning experience they had. Fortunately, from time to time, NSCs have exercises to try to get people who would otherwise never see a crisis like this to sit down and say what they would do. And again, normally their first reaction is very much like the reactions of the missile crisis, to be very, very tough. We're going to do this. And then somebody says, yeah, that's a good idea. But if we strike a nuclear target in Russia, what is Putin going to do? I did this in my class where I just make people should have to run at least 3 or 4 moves in the chess of the chessboard. As Bismarck said, beware of playing chess 1 move at a time. So basically, if you don't play it out, but as people play it out, they look and they think, oh my God, could this really happen? I don't really think so, so maybe I don't. But they go through the experience. So I think the big takeaway from such experiences is generally very sobering for people as they consider that it's not only what I'm going to do, but it's what my actions are going to do is the next step. Then where I'm going to be, and then what am I going to do? Finally, on the question of strategic ambiguity, which is a very good question. It's a big, deep topic for thinking about in terms of deterrence. There's no question in my mind, whatever, that Putin rationally calculates that if he conducted a nuclear strike on the US, which he could do, that the response would be just devastating for him, and therefore a suicide act. No, good. He's deterred. He's clear of that. I think there's no doubt in his mind that if he conducts a nuclear strike from NATO territory, he's in the soup. Okay? There's a domain land that's called Ukraine. There's no guarantees with respect to that, so he's got a space to operate differently. I think if we wanted today to say to Putin, and Putin right the next, and he said, any nuclear strike on Ukraine will be responded to by a nuclear strike on Russia and the US. Would that add to deterrence? Hugely. Hugely. And why would Biden not do that? Because he thinks if Putin struck, he might have to respond. And if he responded, where would that lead him? So when I like Scott's very much, you're getting on not an escalation ladder, but an escalator. That should be contribution to the conversation.
Here, here. Let's give a last word to Svetlana and grab some tactical nuclear comments. What equals what chips?
There was a moment of a possibility of dealing with tactical nuclear weapons during the mid to late 1980s, when after the INF Treaty was signed between Gorbachev and Reagan, they were talking about moving now to shorter range nuclear weapons. And unfortunately, these negotiations really did not continue. And there were unilateral measures by President Bush in September 1991, which were reciprocated by the Soviets. But the partner disappeared. the Soviet Union and Gorbachev with, the Soviet Union disappeared as a negotiating partner. So that conversation ended at the level of unilateral tactical pullback from Europe. However, because these negotiations never really continued, we now don't know how many, I mean, we have estimates, but we really don't know how many tactical nuclear weapons Russia has. And I don't think that Russia would negotiate on tactical nuclear weapons now, partly because of the geographical situation and situation on Russia's borders. It puts premium on tactical nuclear weapons as opposed to the United States with two friendly and weak neighbors. So I think we all, as people who study nuclear weapons and international history and crisis management, should think about ways of making it acceptable for Russia in the future, because there will be future. So thinking about it now will help us prepare some kinds of offers, some kinds of platforms where Russia and NATO, Russia and the United States talk about nuclear weapons, including China tactical nuclear weapons. And I would like to mention something that I forgot from my presentation really fast: the importance of empathy. The importance of empathy, the importance of understanding the other. And here I would allow myself to disagree with something Ash Carter said. He said, certainly there is no moral equivalency. We were the good side and they were the bad side at the missile crisis. I think in terms of value for negotiations, it's not a good setting, not a good framing. If I come to the negotiation saying, hey, look, I'm the good side, you're the evil, we will negotiate just because now it's good for our interests, but that makes you, in any case, much worse than me. We know you will stay evil as you always are, and we will always stay white and good and fuzzy and wonderful. But in this case, I think that's not a helpful approach. You gotta see humanity in the other. You gotta try to understand why they're acting this way. And if you engage the other at some level of equality or some level of respect, then you have open arms.
Should I do one footnote on that?
Okay, Graham, last word.
It's not the last word, but just a footnote, because I think Svetlana's point is so important. Our former president of Harvard University, Larry Summers, is a good summary of this point. I didn't write it down perfectly, but it says something like the following: that when we're dealing with others, other countries, we should appreciate that not all of them can see as clearly as we do our moral superiority.